A habitat is an area that provides all the needs of an organism to survive and reproduce. Okay, that's what a habitat is. So in other words, it needs to include places to find food, water, shelter, but also mates and other things. In our example of sheep, this would be our rocky hillsides of our valley. The next layer out is the biotic community. Biotic community. Okay, bio equals life, bio means life, and community basically means all the things in that area. All things in area. So the biotic community then includes all the living things within an area, within a given area. So the biotic community of our bighorn sheep would include examples like creosote bushes, mountain lions. You see a bee on a flower, so insects, flowers. Also lizards, reptiles, amphibians like the side-blotched lizard, birds like mockingbird, and many, many other living things that are included in that area. Usually the biotic community of an area can be really extremely wide-ranging. And make sure that you remember that plants are living things, okay? So it's not just things that are out walking around, it's also plants. Okay, our next layer out is the ecosystem. Ecosystem. Remember that as we move out, we're getting larger and larger. The ecosystem includes all living parts, or in other words, the biotic community, and non-living parts of a given area. So it will encompass multiple habitats. You'll find many different habitats within one ecosystem. In our example, the ecosystem of our local bighorn sheep is the Santa Rosa Mountains. Within this ecosystem, we have rocky hillside habitats, we have oasis habitats, we have alluvial fan habitats, and many, many more. It is really essential to make sure that ecosystems remain connected to one another to allow species movement between them, but also to keep those ecosystems healthy and functioning. The Coachella Valley Preserve, which is on the north side of I-10, somewhat near the Washington Street exit, provides a really great example of why this is so important. And if you haven't been out there, I highly recommend going as the weather cools off. It's a really great spot to go. If you're in the lab this semester, hopefully your class is going out to the Coachella Valley Preserve. If you're in my lab, we will definitely be going out there. Now, when this preserve was initially set aside, it only encompassed the sand dunes right in that area. And it was initially set up for two very endangered species found here in our valley, which are the Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard and the Coachella Valley milk vetch, which is a plant. Well, sand dunes are kind of like water. They're constantly moving. Wind blows and picks up the sand and moves it in and out of the area. The manager of the preserve at the time that it was initially started up was Dr. Cameron Barrows. And shortly after the preserve was set up and the boundaries were set, he realized that it was really essential not only to protect the actual area where the dunes existed, but that we also really needed to protect the sources where the sand was being blown in from. He basically argued that if we didn't protect the sand sources, the dunes would eventually disappear, as all that sand would eventually get blown out with no new sand coming into the system. So he did a lot of studies and discovered the primary sources of sand in the valley that were providing sand for the dunes was one major one up at Windy Point. And if you've been out there, you've seen some of the dunes out there. And also there's some smaller sources that exist a little bit to the north. You can see them in this map here. And the arrows on this map show that sand blowing in toward the preserve area, which is in this darker outline here. The result of all this research was that the source areas were also protected under the preserve, and the sand itself is protected. So the rule is that you can move the sand off the road, but you cannot put up any barriers that impact the movement of the sand. So this is why there are no barriers to sand being blown across Indian Canyon and Date Palm. So if you're one of the people driving into work after a windy night on the, you're driving along the 10 and you're trying to get into the valley taking either Indian Canyon or Date Palm, and you're really frustrated because you can't get down one of those roads and therefore traffic's all backed up on the other one, and the road ended up being closed because of sand, now at least you know why, and hopefully you won't be so upset because you understand the reasons behind it. And the Coachella Valley Fringe-Toed Lizard and the Milkvetch thank you for your patience. All right, so ecosystems don't always have to be large. If you're in the lab, when you do our water quality lab, you're going to get a chance to look at a single drop of pond water under the microscope, and you're going to see tiny little microscopic creatures swimming all around. And for them, that tiny little drop of pond water is an entire ecosystem. It provides everything that they need to survive and reproduce right there. Okay, our next layer out is called a landscape. And this is a relatively new term in ecology. In fact, when I went to college, it wasn't really even a term that they discussed at that time. So it's pretty new on the canvas of ecology. And it basically refers to a network of ecosystems that interact and connect. The Coachella Valley as a whole is a landscape. Within the valley, there are many different ecosystems that interact and need to remain connected, and this is a really, really important area of research as our valley develops. Landscape ecologists basically look at the landscape of an area and make sure that the ecosystems in that area remain connected. And they use things like corridors, linkages, and greenways, which is our next layer out. We'll talk about those in a minute, so that species don't get stuck in islands. And this is basically what happened in LA. They developed so quickly and they didn't pay attention to these essential links between the ecosystems that they now have problems with animals using highway underpasses to travel from one area to another. And usually what happens is it results in a few things. One, you get death of the animal. Two, you often get people getting injured from car wrecks and collisions with these animals. And three, a lot of money is spent by the Department of Transportation for cleaning up the roadkill and dealing with any car accidents that happen. So a better solution would be to put in corridors and linkages as areas are developed, which provides animals a safe place to travel and puts our dollars to better use. Those of you who are in my lab got to hear Caroline Conway talk about this when we went up to Whitewater Preserve, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you happen to be looking for a career in ecology, I highly recommend getting into landscape ecology. That's a really neat field that involves a variety of work. You get to get out in the field, but you also get to learn how to work with computers and run GIS programs, which allow you to run computer models to see how various layers within your landscape all work together. And COD actually does offer a GIS class, or at least they have in the past. I think it's only offered, I want to say one semester out of the year, but if this is of interest to you, definitely look into it. Okay, the next layer out which I sort of already mentioned before, is corridors, linkages, and greenways. Boy, my handwriting's getting pretty bad here. This is an N. Now, the term corridors is kind of outdated. I'm dating myself by using that. The new term is linkages. This is what we're supposed to use. So you'll probably hear me say corridors, but you'll probably see me write linkages on exam. I'll try and make sure I have both in there, but you should know that those are basically referring to the same thing. They're interchangeable. These are basically animal highways or passages that are created to allow animals and species to pass from one wilderness area or ecosystem to another. So we'll define them as animal passages between ecosystems. So in the picture, you can see a highway overpass that looks really green. And when you're actually on an overpass like this, and this is considered a linkage, you really can't tell that you're standing above a freeway because you're surrounded by trees and plants. And that's the whole point. We want the animals to feel like they really haven't left the habitat that they're in, forest or grassland, etc. You can also use underpasses for linkages, and we have several of these in our desert, and I am going to put up a link on Blackboard of a story that was done a while back on these underpass corridors that we have in the valley. So if you've got time, make sure to check that out. It's a pretty neat little story. And then greenways actually is sort of the human component to that. And greenways are basically areas that are created for humans to use. So walking, hiking pathways, kind of things set up for human enjoyment. But because they have a lot of greenery in them, they're also useful to animals. However, they're much more likely to bump into humans than they are in a linkage or a corridor. Okay, our next layer out is called an ecotone. An ecotone is where two ecosystems, ecosystems overlap. Okay, so you get, say you've got an ecosystem here that moves into this area, and then you've got another ecosystem that comes in like this. So this area in here that I'm drawing the orange in, this would be your ecotone, that area of overlap. And in the picture here, you can see I actually put up a picture of an aquatic ecosystem and a land ecosystem coming together. In the overlap there in the wetland area, you can see the ecotone. And ecotones have a really high diversity in them. Diversity. High, I should write species. High species diversity. You get a lot of different animals that are coexisting in that area because you're meeting the needs of the animal from this ecosystem, and you're also able to meet the needs of the animals from this ecosystem. So the ecotone has a lot of diversity in there. In the bottom picture, I've drawn a red circle around one of the ecotones we find in our valley, which is where the mountains or hillsides meet the desert floor. And this is where you also, right along the valley floor, will find a lot of diversity of life because of this ecotone or these ecosystem overlaps. Now, if we move out another layer, we come to our biome layer. Biomes. A biome is a very large area of land. We're not going to focus. There are aquatic or water biomes, but we're just sticking to land ones for this class. And it is primarily defined by precipitation, meaning how much rain, etc. it gets every year, and also by temperature. Here's the level that we're looking at. So, how often does it freeze, etc. It's also classified by soil type and the species found there. But I primarily say precipitation and temperature because these two things depend on these two things. So just focus on the fact that biomes are defined primarily by precipitation and temperature. This is an exam question, people. Hint, hint. All right, so as you can imagine, and as you can see in this picture, biomes tend to be distributed latitudinally across the Earth's surface. And what I mean by that is kind of in these horizontal bands. And that's because as we move in either direction away from the equator, we get these bands of weather patterns. And so we get basically these bands of biomes. In this class, we're going to learn about 10 different biomes, and I will actually create a different video lecture to go over those with you. Okay, so this brings us to our outermost layer, and that is the biosphere. Okay, again, the word bio, life, and sphere, basically ball. So the biosphere is defined as the living parts of the Earth's, let me get rid of this, Earth's crust. So it includes our atmosphere, the ground or the soil, the bottom of oceans. You've got, they're still discovering species at the depths of the deepest oceans, and basically anywhere in the Earth's crust that life exists. So anywhere there's bacteria, fungus, any type of living organism is part of the biosphere. Okay, so that kind of sums up the levels of ecology. So what should you know now? What should you know? Number 1, you should understand that ecologists work at varying levels, ranging from the smallest level at the individual to the largest level, the biosphere, and anywhere in between. So ecologists work at varying levels from individual up to biosphere and anywhere in between. And secondly, you need to be familiar with the terms. Familiar. And be able to give examples. This is an A. It's late at night and I'm getting tired. All right, so I'll see you next time when we talk biomes.